Ethan Walker wiped the sweat from his brow as he leaned against the old wooden fence, taking a moment to enjoy the crisp morning air. The golden sunlight stretched across his fields, illuminating rows of crops swaying gently in the breeze. The rhythmic clucking of chickens and the distant low of cattle filled the air, blending into the quiet hum of a life well lived. It was just another peaceful morning on the farm, until the tranquility was shattered by the unmistakable roar of a powerful engine tearing up his dirt driveway. A sleek, black luxury SUV skidded to a stop, sending a cloud of dust billowing into the air. Ethan narrowed his eyes as the driver's door flew open, and out stepped Karen Whitmore, the self-important, overbearing president of the Willow Creek HOA. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the ground as she marched toward him, oversized sunglasses perched atop her perfectly coiffed blonde hair. In one hand, she gripped a thick stack of papers, waving them around like they were sacred law. "You," she snapped, pointing an accusatory finger at him as if he were a criminal caught in the act. "You are single-handedly destroying our property values." Ethan blinked, unfazed. "Morning to you too," he said, his voice laced with dry amusement. "And you are?" Karen let out an exaggerated huff, like the mere fact that he didn't recognize her was an insult in itself. "Karen Whitmore," she declared, puffing up with self-importance. "President of the Willow Creek HOA. And your so-called farm is ruining the aesthetics of our community." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head as he leaned against his pitchfork. "Lady, this farm was here long before your cookie-cutter houses popped up. I don't answer to your HOA." Karen's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Whether you're part of the HOA or not is irrelevant," she snapped. "Your unsightly barn, your noisy animals, and that horrid smell are unacceptable. Our community has standards, and you are violating every single one." Ethan crossed his arms, unimpressed. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" A slow, smug smile spread across Karen's face. "Oh, you'll find out soon enough," she said, her tone dripping with menace. "I'll make sure you comply one way or another." Ethan let out a short laugh. "You can try," he said, turning back toward his crops. "But I've got work to do." That should have been the end of it. But Ethan had underestimated Karen's obsession with control. He had barely taken another step before he heard the unmistakable click of a gun. His body tensed. Slowly, he turned back around, his stomach twisting as he took in the sight of Karen standing there, her manicured hands gripping a small handgun, her fingers trembling slightly. "You're kidding," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Over a farm? Come on, lady, this is a bit much, even for you." "I'm serious." Karen barked, her voice edged with desperation. "I am tired of you ruining our neighborhood. Either you pack up and leave, or I'll make sure you regret it." Ethan's pulse quickened, but he kept his face neutral. Years of working the land had taught him the value of staying calm, even in the tensest situations. "All right, no need for that," he said, his voice even. "Why don't we just talk this through like civilized people?" "No more talking," Karen snapped, her grip on the gun tightening. "You're leaving today. One way or another." The situation had officially spiraled out of control. Ethan was regretting not installing a gate at the end of his driveway. He was about to try another approach to de-escalate the madness when the distant wail of sirens cut through the air, drawing both their attention. A sheriff's car tore down the driveway, kicking up dust as it came to a sharp halt beside the SUV. The door flew open, and Sheriff Cole Harper stepped out, his hand resting on his holstered gun. His eyes locked onto Karen, assessing the situation in an instant. "Ma'am, drop the weapon," he commanded, his voice steady and firm. Karen froze, her bravado crumbling in an instant. But I was just." "I said drop it," Cole repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Karen's hands trembled as she hesitated for one long second before finally lowering the gun and setting it on the ground. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The sheriff strode forward, shaking his head in disbelief as he picked up the weapon. "Karen Whitmore, you're under arrest for trespassing and brandishing a firearm." The metallic click of handcuffs snapping into place sent a wave of satisfaction through Ethan. Karen's face contorted with outrage as Cole led her toward the squad car. "This isn't over," she shrieked over her shoulder. "You'll regret this, Walker. You'll regret every bit of it." The sheriff chuckled as he opened the car door. "Oh, I have no doubt we'll be seeing each other again real soon, Karen." Ethan watched as the squad car disappeared down the road, shaking his head in disbelief. He had dealt with plenty of difficult people before, but this was a new level of crazy. Figuring it was just another wild story to tell at the next town gathering, he picked up his pitchfork and got back to work. But deep down, he knew, this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind of person to give up easily. And if her parting words were anything to go by, this was just the beginning of something much worse. Ethan Walker had faced his fair share of trouble in life: droughts, equipment failures, the occasional stubborn cow that refused to be herded, but nothing had prepared him for the storm that followed Karen Whitmore's arrest. He had thought that with her in handcuffs, he could finally move on, that she'd be too embarrassed to show her face again. But Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat. The first sign of trouble came 2 mornings later, when a delivery truck rolled up to his house. A well-dressed courier stepped out, clipboard in hand, and handed Ethan a thick, formal-looking envelope. "For you, sir." Ethan frowned, tearing it open. The moment his eyes skimmed the first few lines, his stomach twisted. It was a lawsuit. The Willow Creek HOA, led by none other than Karen, was suing him. They claimed his farm was an unlawful nuisance that was devaluing nearby properties. The lawsuit demanded that he either demolish certain unsightly structures, including his barn and tool shed, or face daily fines that would bankrupt him within months. He clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to crumple the papers in his fist. It was a move straight out of Karen's playbook. She had failed to intimidate him with a gun, so now she was using the legal system to strangle him out of his own home. Frustrated but not defeated, he called Maddie Brooks, the sharpest attorney he knew. Maddie had a reputation for taking down HOA overreach like a bloodhound with a bone, and the moment he explained the situation, she let out a low, amused laugh. "Oh, this is going to be fun," she said. "She has no jurisdiction over you. This is nothing more than a temper tantrum wrapped in legal jargon." Ethan smirked. "Glad you're enjoying yourself." "Oh, trust me," she replied, her voice laced with anticipation. "By the time I'm done, Karen's going to wish she had stayed in jail." The case went to court 3 days later. The small-town courtroom was packed, word had spread fast, and locals who had been dealing with HOA harassment for years showed up just to see Karen get put in her place. She sat at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by her most loyal HOA cronies, wearing an air of smug confidence. Maddie wasted no time dismantling their case. "Your Honor, this lawsuit is a joke. My client, Ethan Walker, owns private property that is not under HOA jurisdiction. The plaintiff has zero authority over him, and this is clearly a personal vendetta." Karen's lawyer, a nervous-looking man who seemed better suited for writing wills than arguing in court, stumbled through a weak argument about Ethan's farm being an eyesore. "Have you filed any official complaints with environmental agencies or zoning boards in the past 2 years?" Maddie asked when Karen took the stand. Karen's confidence wavered. "Well, no, but..." "So in 2 years, despite all this alleged chaos, you never once reported an actual violation?" Maddie's eyes gleamed. "Instead, you showed up on his land, pulled a gun on him, and now you're suing him?" The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Karen's face flushed. The final blow came when Karen smugly presented an obscure zoning law she claimed would force Ethan to comply. Matty barely glanced at the document before grinning. "Your Honor, this law applies only to commercial properties within HOA jurisdiction. Mr. Walker's farm is neither." Karen's face turned a furious shade of red. The judge sighed, clearly unimpressed. "I've heard enough. This case is dismissed. Mr. Walker is under no obligation to comply with HOA rules." He leveled his gaze at Karen. "And Mrs. Whitmore, I strongly suggest you cease further actions against Mr. Walker, or next time, you may find yourself facing serious legal consequences." The gavel slammed down, and the courtroom erupted into whispers and hushed laughter. Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. Or so he thought. Karen stormed out, but she wasn't retreating, she was regrouping. The very next morning, Ethan woke up to something far worse than a lawsuit. His reputation was under attack. Flyers had been plastered across town, stuffed into mailboxes, pinned to bulletin boards at the local diner, even taped to the windows of his favorite supply store. The headline alone made his blood boil. "Unsafe farm endangering community. What your HOA won't tell you." The flyer was filled with outright lies, claiming that his farm was polluting the local water supply, that his animals were a health hazard, that he ran dangerous machinery at all hours of the night. It accused him of harboring illegally slaughtered livestock and suggested he was ignoring fire safety regulations. Online, things were even worse. The HOA had flooded local Facebook groups and Google reviews with fabricated horror stories, warning people to avoid his farm. Some of his customers started pulling away. A local restaurant that regularly bought his fresh eggs canceled their order, citing concerns about contamination. Ethan felt a deep, simmering rage burn in his chest. This wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was an attempt to ruin his life. And worst of all, some people in town were starting to believe it. At the general store, he overheard two older men whispering near the register. "I heard his cows are sick. That's what the HOA's been saying." "I dunno. I always liked Ethan, but what if they're right? Maybe he isn't keeping things up to code." Ethan slammed a gallon of feed onto the counter harder than he intended, drawing their attention. "My cows aren't sick," he said flatly. "And I'd appreciate if you'd come to me before believing a damn thing Karen Whitmore has to say." The men muttered an apology, but the damage was done. Back home, he paced the length of his porch, his fists clenching. He'd fought off Karen in court, but she wasn't going to stop. She was turning the entire town against him. But if she thought he was just going to roll over and take it, she was dead wrong. Ethan had won the first battle. Now, he had to win the war. Ethan Walker had seen a lot in his years of farming: bad weather, equipment failures, even the occasional run-in with difficult neighbors, but nothing compared to the sheer madness Karen Whitmore had unleashed. With her lawsuit dead in the water, she had turned to dirty tactics, and Ethan soon realized she was determined to make his life a living hell. It started small. One morning, a health inspector showed up at his farm, clipboard in hand, a sour look on his face. "We've received multiple complaints about unsanitary conditions," the man said, barely looking up from his paperwork. "Anonymous reports claim your livestock are not properly contained and that your water supply is contaminated." Ethan crossed his arms, already knowing exactly who was behind this nonsense. "Anonymous, huh?" The inspector shrugged. "Regulations require us to investigate any claims, anonymous or not." Ethan led him around the farm, showing him pristine water sources, well-maintained fencing, and healthy animals. The inspector checked everything, jotting notes, testing samples, looking for any excuse to issue a citation. But after an hour of searching, he found nothing. "Everything looks fine," the inspector finally admitted, tucking his clipboard under his arm. "But you might want to be prepared. Looks like someone's got a grudge. Ethan exhaled sharply. Yeah, I figured that out already. The inspector left, but the attacks kept coming. 2 days later, Ethan walked out to the fields and found his irrigation system in ruins. Someone had slashed the main water line in multiple places, letting thousands of gallons of water spill uselessly into the dirt overnight. His crops, just starting to show promise for the season, were already wilting from dehydration. It was deliberate, calculated sabotage. Furious, Ethan spent the entire day repairing the damage, cursing under his breath with every swing of his hammer. But as soon as he patched up one thing, something else went wrong. The following morning, his tractor wouldn't start. At first, he thought it was a mechanical failure, until he checked the fuel tank and found sugar poured inside. His heart pounded with rage. That wasn't just vandalism, that was a full-blown attack on his livelihood. Repairs were expensive, and Karen knew it. She was trying to bleed him dry, one piece of equipment at a time. But the worst was yet to come. One night, Ethan was lying in bed, exhausted from the constant battle against Karen's harassment, when a sharp, acrid smell drifted through his open window. Smoke. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Something was burning. He shot out of bed and bolted outside. His barn was engulfed in flames. The fire roared, the heat pressing against his skin as he stumbled backward, watching in horror as the flames devoured his storage of feed, his tools, and a season's worth of harvested crops. He grabbed the nearest hose, trying desperately to put it out, but it was pointless. The fire was already too strong. By the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The barn collapsed in on itself, sending a massive shower of sparks into the night sky. Ethan stood there, fists clenched, heart pounding, watching everything he had worked for burn to the ground. Sheriff Cole Harper arrived minutes later, his expression grim as he surveyed the wreckage. "Damn, Walker," he muttered. "This wasn't an accident." "No kidding," Ethan bit out. Cole sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You got cameras on the property?" Ethan's stomach twisted. He had been meaning to install more security, but between the lawsuit and repairs, it had fallen to the bottom of his priority list. But he did have one camera facing the barn. They rushed to Ethan's house, pulling up the footage. The screen flickered to life, showing a shadowy figure sneaking along the side of the barn. The person moved quickly, dumping something, a flammable liquid. Then, in a single, shocking motion, the figure lit a match and tossed it inside. Ethan's blood ran cold. The camera wasn't high quality enough to make out the face, but the body shape and the way they moved was unmistakable. Travis Mitchell. One of Karen's closest allies in the HOA. Ethan turned to Cole, his voice low and controlled. "That's him. That's Travis." Cole exhaled, nodding. "That's enough for an arrest." The next morning, Travis was hauled off in handcuffs. Karen had gone too far, and now one of her own was paying the price. But as Ethan watched the squad car pull away, he knew Karen wasn't done. She still had cards to play. And if she was willing to burn his farm to the ground, there was no telling how far she'd go next. The fire was still fresh in everyone's minds when Karen Whitmore made her next move. With Travis Mitchell sitting in a jail cell, the town had started murmuring about just how far the HOA was willing to go to get rid of Ethan Walker. Many assumed Karen would finally back down, that the barn fire was a line even she wouldn't dare cross again. But Ethan knew better. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds and walk away, she was regrouping. Less than a week after the fire, Ethan was finishing repairs to his fencing when a familiar delivery truck pulled into his driveway. The driver stepped out, handing him yet another thick envelope. Ethan already knew what it was before he even opened it. Another lawsuit. He tore through the pages, his anger mounting with every line. This time, the HOA wasn't just demanding he make changes to his farm. They were trying to seize part of his land. His heart pounded as he read the claim. According to an old town record Karen had uncovered, a portion of his property, the same portion where his barn once stood, had been part of a long-forgotten land agreement from the early 1900s. Back then, a now-defunct company had owned a strip of land that was later sold to the housing development that became Willow Creek. Karen was arguing that this land technically fell under HOA jurisdiction. And if the HOA controlled it, they could legally demand he vacate it. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. She had really outdone herself this time. He wasted no time calling Maddie Brooks. She listened in silence as he explained the situation, then exhaled sharply. "She's really digging deep now, isn't she?" "You have no idea," Ethan muttered. "Can she actually pull this off?" Maddie didn't hesitate. "Not a chance." The case was rushed into court. Karen, emboldened by what she clearly believed was her masterstroke, sat in the plaintiff's chair with a smug expression, her arms crossed like she had already won. She played her part well, dramatically presenting the old land record like she had uncovered the missing piece of a century-old puzzle. This property, as per this document, was originally attached to the HOA's land, Karen said smoothly. "We are merely claiming what was always meant to be part of the Willow Creek community." Ethan clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to scoff. Maddie, on the other hand, simply leaned back in her chair, as if she were waiting for Karen to dig her own grave. When Karen finished, Maddie stood, picking up the ancient document with a knowing smirk. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct your attention to the date on this record." She held it up for the judge to see. 1912. A murmur spread through the room. Karen's expression faltered slightly. "This document is over a century old," Maddie continued, her voice calm but sharp as a knife. "Not only is it irrelevant under modern zoning laws, but the company that originally owned the land hasn't existed for nearly 70 years. Furthermore, the land was legally incorporated into the county before Willow Creek HOA was even established." She flipped through a separate set of documents and placed them on the judge's desk. "These are the official zoning records, which show that Mr. Walker's farm is on county land, not within HOA jurisdiction. This case has no legal basis, it is nothing more than a desperate attempt to harass my client." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the judge held up a hand to silence her. "I don't need to hear any more," he said, rubbing his temple as if he were exhausted by the sheer absurdity of the case. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is the second time you've dragged this man into court over nonsense. If I see you in here again trying to weaponize the legal system against Mr. Walker, you're going to find yourself facing real consequences." Karen's face went pale. Ethan could see it happening, the slow, dawning realization that she had lost. Not just this case, but the entire war. The judge let out a sigh, then slammed his gavel down. Case dismissed. The courtroom erupted into cheers. Ethan exhaled, relief washing over him like a flood. It was over. Karen, on the other hand, was shaking with rage. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking furiously against the floor, but for the first time, there was no smugness in her step, just raw, humiliated fury. Ethan watched her go, shaking his head. He should have felt triumphant, but he knew Karen wasn't done yet. She had lost in court. But he had the feeling she wasn't done playing dirty. With the case dismissed and Karen publicly humiliated, Ethan Walker finally felt like he could breathe again. The town had seen through her lies, the judge had warned her against further harassment, and the HOA's grip on his life had finally been broken. But what Ethan hadn't expected was just how much support he would receive in the aftermath. It started with a few neighbors stopping by his farm, offering words of encouragement. Then came the small businesses, shop owners, restaurant managers, even other farmers, people who had watched the battle unfold and wanted to make it clear whose side they were on. They showed up with supplies, tools, and fresh materials to help him rebuild what Karen had destroyed. A few folks even pitched in money to help cover his legal fees, though Ethan refused most of it, touched by the gesture alone. Then, someone made a sign. HOA free zone, no Karens allowed. It was meant as a joke, but it became a symbol of resistance. More people showed up, asking if they could put up similar signs on their own properties, wanting to send a clear message: enough was enough. The town had put up with HOA overreach for too long, and Ethan's fight had given them the push they needed to stand their ground. To celebrate, Ethan decided to throw a farm gathering, a thank you party for everyone who had supported him. The night was filled with music, laughter, and enough barbecue to feed an army. People swapped stories about their worst HOA nightmares, sharing frustrations, victories, and horror stories of power-hungry board members like Karen. But the most surprising moment of the night came when Karen herself showed up. She stood at the edge of the party, shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the woman who had once tried to control the entire town. Ethan spotted her and walked over, wary but curious. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quietly. "But I wanted to say I was wrong. About all of it." Ethan studied her for a long moment. He didn't trust her, not yet, but there was no arrogance in her voice this time, only regret. "It takes guts to admit that," he finally said. He gestured toward the table of food. "You hungry?" Karen hesitated, then nodded. And just like that, for the first time, Karen Whitmore was no longer the enemy, just another person who had lost their way. In the days that followed, Karen officially stepped down from the HOA, disappearing from the neighborhood spotlight. The board was left scrambling, struggling to recover from the damage she had done to their reputation. And Ethan? He went back to farming, his land now stronger than ever, knowing that no matter what came next, he had a community behind him. But the real question is, how far have you seen an HOA or power-hungry neighbor go? Have you ever felt powerless against their rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.